Welcome to Can I Get a Retake, where we explore the accomplishments of our innovative community.
Each month, we speak with one of Great River Learning's higher ed instructors and authors.
Together, we discuss trends in education, areas of study, and a variety of teaching styles and philosophies.
My name is Macayla, your marketing coordinator.
My name is Michelle, your web design supervisor.
And this is Great River Learning's Can I Get a Retake? Today on Can I Get a Retake, we are speaking with Dr. Adrienne Brundage. Dr. Brundage is an assistant instructional professor and assistant director of the Forensic and Investigative Sciences program at Texas A&M University.
She is a board-certified forensic entomologist and lecturer of entomology and forensics. She received her PhD in entomology from Texas A&M University and has worked as a forensic entomologist across North America since 1999.
She is a member of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences and works as a member of the Wildlife Forensics Consensus Body, a subset of the Academy Standards Board.
Dr. Brundage consults with law enforcement agencies and private entities on cases of abuse, neglect, and death. She speaks and leads training seminars in forensic entomology across the country.
Her current research involves the colonization of human remains by dipteran species, aka flies, as well as the interactions among larvae and bacteria.
Most importantly, but we're biased, Dr. Brundage is the author of The Game is Afoot, An Introduction to Forensic Science, and Veterinary Entomology. It's all fun and games until someone gets Lyme disease with Great River Learning. So we have a question. Our podcast is called Can I Get a Retake? Just kind of a call to some questions we get from students throughout the year. So we wanted to ask you, have you ever been asked, can I get a retake?
Oh, that is a constant question. It's, yeah. I try to build in all my questions or all my exams. Here's all the extra credit and here's all the stuff, but that is pretty much guaranteed. The first question I'm going to get in my email, first question, my office hours after an exam or a quiz, or I don't know, after an eclipse of the sun, it's always going to be a question. And I even have my frequently asked questions. The answer doesn't matter. Yes. Every day, all day, every semester.
All right, well, to jump in, can you tell us just a little bit about your background and, how you got into teaching and at Texas A&M where you are now?
So then I'm Dr. Adrienne Brundage. I'm a board certified forensic entomologist. And so I do expert witness testimony and casework and all that. And I have this firm belief that if you know, or if you can do something out in the world, you should teach it, because then you are actually helping those who want to do it. And so and also I get a little rankled at that whole, if you can't do teach phrase. And so now I'm taking it, being petty about it. But so because I do entomology and forensics, that's what I love teaching. And I started at A&M. I actually got my PhD there starting in 2008. Before that, I was at San Jose State University. So I got my master's and then was hired on as faculty teaching biology, microbiology, or botany, whatever they needed, basically. And then before that, I had my bachelor's at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo in California. So I moved out to Texas for the PhD, and I was faculty one semester and then a PhD student the other for a couple of years. Until they found a full-time faculty to teach the classes I was teaching. And then they just hired me full-time after I graduated. And I'm now the assistant director of their forensic science program. And I teach the most students, it feels like. Yeah, so I've just sort of never left. They gave me an office, dug in like a tick, and I'm never leaving.
Can you tell us a little bit about what forensic entomology is for
Sure.
curious listeners?
Yeah, so this is the use of insects to help solve crimes. Any science can be a forensic science as long as it's associated with the court of law. That's all forensics means, is associated with court. So as a forensic entomologist, I went that route because, one, it's the best subject in the world, and it combines the two things I love most, forensics and entomology, and who knew that was a real thing? So I found out about that in the 90s. Yeah, it's the use of insects solve crime. So I get called in whenever there are bugs of some sort or closely related organisms, either on a body is where I primarily do most of my work, either on a dead body or on dead animals or living for that matter. Or if there's insect in food or in somebody's house or something, whenever there's a lawsuit happening, that's when I get called in, and I can tell them what I can. But my number one question is, how long has this dead person been here, or how long has this dead animal been here? So I tend to specialize in wildlife. That's animals, because there's not a lot of people doing that. So I get called in by a lot of nonprofits, ASPCA, that sort of thing. If there's been animal abuse, by police departments, by the federal government, that sort of thing, asking how long has this been going on. And so I can look at the size and age of the insects and calculate approximately how long they've been feeding on that animal or body. And then that can equate to the time of death or the time of neglect or whatever it is.
So when you're asked by investigators to help, like, what does that look like? So what are they sending you, and what are you specifically doing to sort of test for those things?
It depends on the case. Sort of a typical case, say I'll be called in by whomever. This can be detectives from the police department. It can be, nonprofit, a vet, a private investigator, a private family if they needed something. Let's assume it's just an investigator at a police department and it's a dead person. What they're going to do is they're either going to have me come out to the crime scene if it's close enough, but it's usually hot outside, and so I don't want to. So they just send me the stuff. And yeah, since there aren't many of us in the country, primarily we get FedExed evidence, and that evidence is going to be whatever insects they've pulled off the body. Sometimes any other weird stuff. We ask for like soil samples and that sort of thing. I also get the case file and photos and anything that they deem important. And the medical examiner's report especially is important. And so then I identify the insects down to species. And what's neat about these bugs is they are decomposers. So they're the reason we're not knee deep in dead things all the time. Remember back to your basic bio, it's that whole nitrogen cycle, the nutrient cycle in the world. We're just a big bag of carbon and nitrogen, water, minerals. And once we're done with it, it gets released out into the world for every other living thing to take it on. And insects are a huge reason that happens so quickly. They can go through this decomposing material within hours or days, depending on how big. They are also cold-blooded. And so depending on the ambient temperature, they grow faster if it's warmer and slower if it's colder. That's why you don't see a lot of insects out when it's super cold out. They just can't raise their own body temperature, but they grow at this linear rate, and it is well documented how fast they grow according to the ambient temperature. And each species is a little bit different, but once we have that data, once we know exactly how quickly they grow at these different temperatures, we can just use it to calculate by looking at the ambient temperature, use our little formula, calculate how old this maggot is. Like, okay, this one is this age or this size. It would have taken them 5 days to get to this size. And then we make an assumption. If we assume that those insects showed up really close to the time of death, which they will, they're really good at what they do. They can show up within seconds or minutes of just something needing to be decomposed being available. And if we assume they show up right away, we can say, well, if this person was available for colonization and they weren't in a freezer for 40 years or something, they just died right there, the flies are going to show up. So however old they are in hours or days, it's likely how long that body's been there. So if a medical examiner can't tell you, I can come in and give you a range, and it's not, down to the hour, because that's not how bugs work. But I can say, well, this person was available for colonization between, this date and this date. And so that can narrow this down for them. And it's information they didn't have before. And yeah, that's basically what I do. And then other situations, it's like, well, this bug was in my food. Why is it there? And who do I sue? And so I can help them with that. I just worked one with a pretty popular fast food company that had maggots in there. And so much to the chagrin of my students who were helping me, I just DoorDashed a bunch of food and we put maggots on it. And they're like, what are we doing? And I was like, science. We're doing science. I'm going to go be deposed for this. Yeah. So it just matters the case, but they generally just send me bugs. I look at them and tell them what I can, send them back.
Yeah.
Mentions being deposed. Like, what does that look like?
Yeah.
in the
So
courtroom?
yeah, it's there's a bunch of different steps to go into court. I mean, most of my cases don't go to court because it is such a drawn out process, and a lot of people either settle or get a confession or whatever. But usually before court case begins, if there's no settlement happening, they're going to court. They bring in all the witnesses and you sit for a deposition. It's basically discovery for the lawyers. Usually whoever has hired you, their lawyer will depose you first. And this is a legal document. So everything you say is considered legal. You know, it's that. So I have to prove that I know what I'm doing and make sure that they know that I am who I am. So I usually have to bring my passport, or if it's on Zoom, which has happened since the pandemic. And I love this so much, man, just on Zoom. I just have a bunch of like certificates and awards behind me because that usually see, it's me, my certifications. And that makes it a lot easier. On my side, at least. And then, they just record everything and they just ask a bunch of questions to make sure that I know what I'm talking about. And then they understand exactly what I'm testifying to. So they'll go through my report if I've written one, ask me a bunch of questions on that. So then the lawyer gets a good grasp of that. And then I get deposed by opposing attorneys. And they try to poke holes in the testimony and see what's going on. But it's basically expert witness testimony, just not in court, and oftentimes on Zoom. And so it can be really short. I've sat for a deposition that they asked one question and then left. I was like, oh, okay. And that was when I flew out to it. Like I had to go in person. And I was like, so all this, okay, whatever you need. I put on makeup for this. And I do that often. But yeah. And then others, like I just sat for one that was 4.5 hours as they were just trying to figure it out. This was a civil case and there was a lot of money involved. And so, yeah, they were trying to figure it out. And so I just let them argue it and I just answer the questions that are asked. So yeah, it's basically like smaller court without a jury.
Yeah. So how do they find you? Are they Googling?
Yeah, actually, a lot of them are. And so, you know, I grew up, well, I was in college in the 90s. So I've got websites. So I got forensicentomologist.com and I've just kept it. And, you know,
awesome.
Yeah, so right. And the upside of working in tech in the 90s.
Yeah.
And so, I have that. And so if people do that, they can find me. But then I do a lot of speaking tours. Like I give a lot of talks and a lot of places ask me just to come and talk about forensic entomology. I've got my generalized talk. So I go and do that and people get my name from there. I do a lot of trainings. So I train every year investigators at the body farm here in Texas, teach them how to use insects off the bodies, that sort of thing. So they get to actually practice it in real life. And yeah, I just do a lot of these sorts of interviews and I'm as the professor assistant director at Texas A&M, people get to know me. So when they search Texas A&M, my name comes up and, you know, it's just mostly making a pest of myself for years. And now people know my name. I go to a lot of conferences and bother people.
You know, in your title, you do talk about one of your least favorite questions from students is the comparison between what you do and what they see on, let's say, CSI.
Oh my goodness.
Explain the difference between TV and the reality.
Yeah, this is something, I mean, it has caused a boon for forensic programs, let me tell you. In college, people grow up watching all of these TV shows and they go, I want to do that. It looks so amazing. And then they get here and we're like, great, take all the biologies and all the chemistries and every physics we can think of. And also you have to keep a really high GPA. And they're like, what is happening? I just wanted to look cute and be at a crime scene. Never looked cute at a crime scene. But they, it's TV is TV and it is there for entertainment. And if you were to televise exactly what I do on a case, it involves playing an audiobook at double speed and putting my face in a microscope for 3 days. Like that's what I do. And then I read some papers and then I type a bunch of stuff. That is not exciting for TV. And my interns figure that out the first case they get to work. But yeah, it's everything on TV is very sensationalized, of course. They're taking all the absolute most interesting parts and putting them into one job. And so our, the biggest issues are with those basic CSI shows and that sort of thing, because that shows things like expert witnesses running down suspects and questioning them. And like, man, I don't have a gun. I've never run down a suspect. Like, I sit in my car and read a book until they're ready for me, or I stay at my house and then they send me evidence to my lab. Like, I don't do any of that. And I especially don't wear really nice clothes to a crime scene. Like, I wear BDU pants and boots that smell like death. That's my look. So it's all sensationalized and it's all really nice and neat. So when you watch some of these episodes, it's nothing is messy. It's very much, there's this one piece of evidence that broke the whole thing open. And the reality is most of the time it's very wishy-washy and there's no conclusion. And there are a lot of cases that go cold because there isn't that one piece of evidence. And it's for sensationalism. It's for entertainment. And while some of this can be entertaining, I do have some great stories, but those stories, took like 6 months to get the full conclusion. And I put them down to 20 minutes or 5 minutes when I tell somebody that sounds amazing. Sure. Yeah, it was 3,000 hours of work is what it was. And you're welcome. I left out the boring ones. So yeah, they just leave out all the boring bits. And then it gets to the point where they're doing stuff that isn't actually possible. And this is where it's honestly become a problem. There is a concept called the CSI effect that we have to take into account now when we go to court, because potential jurists or witnesses or perpetrators, whatever, they've watched these shows. And so they think they know what can be done and what can't be. And they're wrong on both sides. Mm-hmm. So it'll be things like the jury will assume that there's always going to be DNA evidence and it's always going to be down to one person. And like, it was a fender bender. It was like 2 cars. There's no DNA. What are you doing? But they want it or they won't believe it. Or in my case, I had actually investigators call me and they were asking for for me to track down where this car was driving. What they had done is they had scraped the windshield and the headlights and taken any insect parts out of like the filter and sent me all these insect parts. And I'd asked them to send me through a remailer. So I didn't know where they were coming from because I didn't want to bias myself in any way. And then my job is to figure out where this car driven based on the bugs on it. And there's, some stuff to that, but I was able to narrow it down to the state because those are the bugs, and then possibilities of where this person drove just based on what we have out there. What they wanted was me to show that he had driven from one neighborhood to another. Oh. And I was like, that it's like 4 mosquitoes and a bunch of honeybees. No, they have wings. I don't know what to tell you. And then I was watching CSI and I found the episode where they did that. And I went, come on, you're investigators. So it's easy to even fall for it when you know what's happening. If it's slightly outside your area of expertise, you're like, oh, of course that's possible. But yeah, pretty much everything on there is no, they speed it up for TV, and I've never worn heels at a scene. And dear, could you imagine? And I don't carry a gun or question witnesses. I don't even know the perpetrator's name to try to keep my bias down. So none of that. I spend my life in a lab. That's pretty much it. Sometimes I get to go outside.
I put maggots on DoorDash.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Sometimes I just never go back to certain restaurants. Never go out to eat with an entomologist who specializes in stored product entomology, because they're like, oh yeah, don't eat there. They're awful. Don't eat there. Like, it's every place has a problem.
We're going to have to talk with you after we're done recording.
Just better if you don't know.
Well, I do want to go back to talking about bugs a bit.
Okay.
More, which I'm sure you're not mad about. So I was just, I guess, your research specifically looks at flies, right? Yes. Diptera species as flies. Can you explain, I guess, what you're researching, or does it just directly tie into the age of the bugs themselves, or are you researching something else?
Well, my research, it depends on what I'm interested in. That's the beauty of my personal position, or my position at A&M, is because I'm primarily a teacher and a and the assistant director, I don't have to keep a lab with one cohesive direction. And so a lot of my research is with students, and I do research on teaching and I do research on the flies as needed. So, and then whatever my students need to know. And so I get students coming to me asking me about that. But my primary area of expertise is in flies. And I did a lot of research and am doing a lot of research on the how flies know, one, that things are dead, because that's fascinating to me. And then I had noticed that they show up on bodies or on things that are dead en masse. And there's a lot of information out there about competition and cooperation and such in large groups in insects and other animals. And it seemed a little weird at first. Why would I see thousands upon thousands of flies on something dead? Because that's what we call an ephemeral resource. It's going to go away. So that's a massive competition. And so looking into it, they feed as a large maggot mass. And they have what's called exodigestion. So instead of taking a bite and swallowing, they puke up their guts and let it digest outside. And then they soak up the digestive products, I guess you would call it. And that is much more efficient in a huge number than it is with one or two. So when a fly shows up, it makes sense that they would want as many other individuals to come in, be about the same age, so they could all eat together and be very, very efficient, get the most food quickly. Rather than, try to keep that whole body for themselves. And so what they do is when a female lays her eggs, she lays them in these clutches of about 300 eggs all glued together. So they're safe, but they're covered with bacteria. And that bacteria will multiply super, super fast. And other flies can cue in on that bacteria and actually figure out how old the eggs are that have been laid by hours. And so if they're within about 8 to 10 hours of each other, they're all laying on top of each other. So I've seen out in the field in some of our stuff, bodies that have these egg clutches that are the size of softballs. It's 40,000 individual eggs in there. And I know that because I counted them and research. And so softball size thing. But then there comes a point where no other flies come in. It's like they're repelled. And sure enough, that bacteria has changed enough that the flies coming in going, oh, my babies are going to be way too young. They won't be able to work with these. They're going to outcompete. And so they go find another body. Awesome. But then there's a species of fly that is cannibalistic and predatory once it gets older. So it actually likes to come in a little bit later because it wants those sort of young-ish maggots, but not too much older than them so they can't run away. So they come in about 12 to 24 hours after these, and they use the bacteria. And then they take advantage of the big maggot mass when they're super tiny, but when they get older, they just start eating everybody that they run into. And it's an amazing thing. So that was my major research. And that was super fun. And then I figured out how to get rid of those bacteria on the eggs, because some of these flies we use as medical maggots. And so they eat decomposing material on a living animal or person. And it's better than surgery on these really large wounds. And you can do it in places where there aren't hospitals. And so the problem is if you put eggs on there, you're bringing in all that bacteria and you can cause even worse problems. So we try to surface sterilize them, but most of the chemicals we use kill most of the eggs. And then, you're wasting a lot of time. So I figured there's got to be a way to do this better. So I tried a bunch of those, and then I just went looking through the closets, and I found that Lysol, just over-the-counter Lysol, will leave us with a 90% hatch rate and kills 99.9% of the maggots on there, or the bacteria on there. So the maggots are fine. I mean, it was made as a douche originally, I learned, for science. And so it's tissue safe. And I guess nobody wanted to be Piney Fresh, but so you can use that and surface sterilize the eggs for super cheap. So that was part of my research. And then now I'm looking at how quickly insects show up on bodies in various areas. And I'm trying to do a survey of forensically important flies in a bunch of different places. For the past several years, I've been down in Trinidad with a couple of students on study abroads, and we've been surveying the forensically important insects down there under a bunch of different circumstances, and then seeing how they react to different things in material. One of my students was looking at she worked at a hospital. I could talk about this all day, so just stop me.
Oh,
You got me started. Not my problem. So she was looking at, she worked at a hospital and she was looking at things that were like, what can people easily OD on that isn't like hard drugs? That's been looked at. So she found people coming in on ODing on alcohol, ODing on cough syrup, and ODing on caffeine, because you can buy it in pill or in powder form now. And this is a common problem in college. So we spiked liver basically with the amount of this substance that would cause it to OD in a human. And we found that when maggots were feeding on this, so assuming somebody OD'd on the substance and died, the maggots would eat it, what would happen? And with alcohol, they slowed down a little bit in their development, but not much. With caffeine, it outright killed them. Like they died so fast. And we're like, oh, that's new and different. And then with cough syrup, it slowed them down a lot, but they still grew. So that was fascinating. And then whenever I have a case, I might have to recreate what goes on with this case. And there's one case I worked where they were asking about if cockroaches could feed on dead bodies. And they do. It just looks like burns on bodies. And this particular case had some inappropriate mutilation, if mutilation is ever appropriate, but there was some genital mutilation in this case, and the guy got the death penalty because of it. And so the defense had contacted me to see if maybe the cockroaches had done that. So I had to write the weirdest report ever, which was cockroaches did not eat his penis. I don't know what to tell you. And then they asked me how I knew, and okay. And so I trapped cockroaches to myself to see if they would bite me, and they don't. And so I just wore those around for a couple of days, and then I got a student to help me. And yeah, cockroaches don't bite you like that. And so now we know. So it's really whatever needs to happen, I just do, and it's really fun.
There were so many things in there.
I
So
parse through it. Yeah. I'm still thinking, like, where's the CSI episode where they let cockroaches, like, your life
could be a
yeah,
CSI episode.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Um,
I mean, you kind of answered part of the question we had, which is like, what implications does your research have for solving?
yeah.
So, there you go.
Yeah, I think
the beauty about research is, and this is what I try to teach my students, is it's just a way of thinking about the world. And with scientists, you make an observation like, oh, that thing happened, and there's a bunch of eggs on this body. Why? And you just learn to ask the question why over and over and over and over again. And you get really annoying about it. And my students kind of hate it when they first get there, because they'll ask me a question and I will make them try to think through the answer. And they'll come up with an answer. My next question will be like, well, why? But why about that? Why about that? And they're like, I'm like, I know, right? It's annoying. But then we go and look up the answer and see if it's there. You just go read your papers and you read your research and all that. And if nobody has answered the question, then you get to, let's figure out how. And so there's just so many things that we can research, and it's fascinating. And my students will come up with the most random things, and it's a lot of fun. I had one student who, she just really wanted to read fantasy books. She was a senior in college. Her parents kept telling her, like, you don't have time to read fantasy books. You got to study, you got to study. So she came to me with this idea for a research project where she wanted to take the major theories in ecology and biology and that sort of thing, and see how they were represented in fantasy as part of a way to get that information to the populace. And because she's all, yeah, when I took ecology, I noticed like these certain fantasy novels had like the biological species concept, but sometimes you have hybrids. You have an elf and a human that have a half elf child, and what happens there? And like, how do we know elves and humans are different species? That like on and on and on. I was like, great. And so we just went to the library and got a librarian involved. And then my student went home and read just so many books, and I had more videos of her parents coming in. She's like, it's for work, it's for science, I'm writing a paper. And she got to read every book she wanted that semester. It was the best paper, and the librarian loved it, and it was actually a really fascinating study. And then I had to read for work. I mean,
Right.
I had to help. It's my job to read these new books. So yeah, they can come up with the most interesting things once they get used to this sort of stuff. And I love playing around with that.
Right.
Well, so okay, I was gonna go back to maggots again, but only because one of the questions we had was how many maggots do fit in a 5-gallon bucket. But
Oh
if
my
that
God. Yeah.
was that the same as the, ones that you
40,000.
counted before?
No, it was way, 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 way more.
Oh my gosh.
Way more. So cranky about it. So yeah, whenever evidence gets sent, we have to put eyes on all of it. So if they send us too little, we're pissed. If they send us too much, we're angry. It's like
Have to be very specific. Only send us
yes.
500 or however
Oh
many.
my God. Yeah. I don't need this many. But then someone will send me just like a ladybug. I'm like, thank you. I did work a case like that. I have photos of this body with maggots all over it, and they sent me a ladybug. I'm like, okay. Now this is the opposite of all right. I don't know. The ladybug was there is my report. I don't know what to tell you. Yeah. So it's, I don't need too many. I don't need too few. I would like around 300, please. Thank you.
So you're also a member of the Wildlife Forensics Consensus Body, and you talk about that a little bit in one of your chapters.
Yeah.
But how are wildlife cases different from humans? Are we talking about different species or
Yes.
elaborate.
So with wildlife forensics, it is animals, all of them. And that means you have to know more about the actual animal in addition to the insects. With human cases, it's for the same species. So body temperature the same, approximately the same size, we age the same, we can figure out how to what drugs might be in there, where they might be, if they're clothed or not, et cetera. With animals, it's a bit different. And since the body size can change, so you can go from the tiniest mouse or lizard or something to an elephant. And that decomposition is going to be very, very different. So with those really small animals, we get different flies that show up on them. And there are certain beetles that will actually take the entire body and bury it and keep that resource away, because on small animals, that competition is a real thing. Like you can't get 40,000 maggots on a mouse, and so they handle it very differently. And then, in dogs, we tend to see it about the same. And that tends to be what I get called in on is dogs, because they're so ubiquitous. But there's also different insects that show up on them when they're alive. And so knowing the lice or the fleas or the ticks or whatever else that prefer dogs and cats and companion animals. And then if we're looking at amphibians and reptiles, they decompose very differently. So because they're so prone to water loss, they will shut up all their external holes or eyes and whatnot, and flies can't really get in there unless they were injured beforehand. And so there's a whole bunch that you have to know, and we have to be able to tell different species of animal apart. That was part of what this wildlife forensics body did. It was several years ago. There was one document we had to write on what is a species, which is sort of the basic question in all of biology. You can't just answer that. We don't have a single answer that works for literally everything. And so we had to determine, how are we going to define an animal species in court? And that took forever, because it's so hard to really figure that out. But it had to be written in a way where lawyers and jury and judge could understand it, and that made sense to the scientific community, and that we could apply across the board. And so that's how a lot of these recommendations or all these rules come into being. Is it's just a committee of people talking about one particular thing for what feels like the rest of our lives.
That's really interesting. I mean, especially honestly, even just the first thing you said, which was animals have different body temperatures.
Yeah.
It's something that I didn't think about, but that would obviously impact so many things.
Oh yeah. When I work my ISS cases, these are the cases where maggots show up on a living body. So if you have a wound and maggots get in there, that's how we figured out about medical maggots, but it's still a thing that happens. It doesn't happen too often anymore on humans, but still pretty common, or more common than we'd like. But it happens a lot on animals, of course, especially long-haired dogs, because you can't see the wounds. And again, flies are good at what they do. You get the right species though, they fly right in, eat just the dead stuff and then leave. And so it actually helps keep the person or the animal alive and helps keep them healthy. But if I get, say, myiasis case on a bedridden human, very common in bed sores, I can figure out how long they've been there based on that person's body temperature, because that's the ambient temperature the maggots are experiencing. Dog body temperature is much higher. Any other animal, they're going to be different. So I have to go and figure out what that dog temperature is. And because I didn't go to vet school, when I first did this, I had to reach out to a bunch of vets and make sure I was correct. I wasn't just making something up or looking at the first hit on Google or something. And that's going to be different for every other animal out there. And so it significantly affects that. And when I'm saying something like this, when I'm giving a report on myiasis, they're asking, how long has this animal or human been neglected? You know, because they had to have a wound, it had to go septic, and then the flies had to show up. Even assuming they showed up as soon as that wound got infected, that's still long enough to get a wound and not be treated. And so it's a really important thing to get right. And so I have to be very, very careful. And I'm often as conservative as I possibly can be, because I don't know what the situation is. And I had better not go out on a limb, because that could mean the difference between going to prison or not for somebody, or having that animal put down or not, or whatever. And so that's a big issue. And so, yeah, everything is different, and it can significantly affect the outcome.
And they're high stake implications. Yeah,
absolutely. And that's what I try to impress upon my forensic science students is, I don't care if you think this is sort of the silliest calculation or whatever, somebody's life is literally going to be in your hands, just whether it be their freedom or a massive fine or going to jail forever or whatever it is. Will affect their lives. And so you had better do this right, no matter what. So I don't care if you think it's boring, do it right anyway. And don't be that person, and don't be a gun for hire and say whatever somebody wants you to say, because I will come for you.
I do like a part of your textbook where you say, you hope some of your students will answer the question, what do you do with I'm a forensic scientist?
Yes.
So what are the different career paths that are available to these students?
Oh, man. So, I mean, our classic forensic scientist is working at a crime lab. And that is the people who are analyzing the evidence and giving out those reports and matching DNA and all those sorts of things. And that is what a lot of my students try to do. But then we can also go into the actual crime scene investigation. So you're the one at the scene collecting the evidence. And depending on where you work, you could be the CSI and forensic scientist analyzing it, or you send it to the lab. It just depends on the size of the place you're working. So there are some places where it's, hey, you are the CSI and the forensic scientist and also the secretary who checks some people in. And then sometimes you do these 12 other things because it's such a tiny place, so forensic scientists are pretty good about multitasking and being able to do a lot of things. Yeah. But then you can go on to be an expert witness in whatever field. So like I went on to entomology. In order to be board certified for that, though, I had to get my PhD and I had to do several years of internships or training under entomologists. Then I had to send in a packet to the American Board of Forensic Entomology, and then I had to sit for a 12-hour exam to prove that I actually know what I'm talking about. And I have to re-up every 5 years. And this is the same type of thing that pretty much every other board certified forensic expert has to do. So for anthropology, they have to do the same basic thing, like fingerprint analysis, microscopy, engineering, whatever. Any science, you can be a forensic scientist, and there's probably a board that governs it. If you want to be a forensic pathologist, you have to be a doctor first and foremost. And then you do your rounds in pathology and autopsy and that sort of thing. If you want to work in veterinary forensics, you have to be a veterinarian first and foremost. If you want to be a forensic odontologist, you have to be a dentist first and foremost. And so it's basically you have to go in and be an expert in that field or as close as you can be. And then learn how to apply that to the crime scene. So the more specialized you get, the higher up you need to go in education, or the further on you need to go in education. And then the more narrow your focus becomes. So it's usually my my bachelor's students and my master's students that go into the crime lab or go into CSI or something like that.
Sure.
So there's a lot you can do. Oh, I have ex-students who have started their own labs. One of them just started a crime scene cleaning business, which is where all the money is apparently. And I'm really upset I didn't do it myself, but she wanted to live in California and she figured that would be the way to do it. And she was correct. Dear Lord, she is. Whew. And so, yeah, there's just pretty much anywhere you go, there's going to be something you can do.
Do you have any advice for those students that want to sort of follow your path?
Oh, man. Decide what you want to do.
Yeah.
I mean, because again, it's if you want to be an expert witness like an entomology, you got to plan for a PhD.
Oh, yeah.
You know, if you want to work at a crime scene, I would suggest doing things like chemistry and biology and physics. Chemistry is especially important in crime labs. I mean, our students basically minor in chemistry. And we have a +1 master's program with another university where if they graduate from us, they've already taken all the chemistry that they would take their first year of their master's program. So they can go for just a year, take a few specialized classes, get their master's in 1 year instead of 2 or 3. And so you take a lot of chemistry for that. But yeah, I think it's decide what you want to do. Really look up a job that you think is your dream job and see what they're requiring, because it can be very, very competitive out there. And so you want to set yourself up as well as possible. And then do internships and volunteer as much as you can. That's really how I got my start in forensic entomology. Was I worked a cold case with my advisor and went, I'm never not doing this, I guess. And so then I went to every conference possible. So people should go to really network. That's how you get everything. Go to all these conferences. And that's how I met some local PD and the local medical examiner. And then I just made a pest of myself. And I just called them and bothered them. One whole summer I just spent hanging out in the waiting room of the medical examiner's office, being like, if you have bugs, let me know. And I just had a lunch and a book. And I think they just felt sorry for me. And that's how I did my first independent case. They didn't even really need it. They just got tired of me eating a sad sandwich in the waiting room. And then, so then that's how I got casework. And then I just started giving talks everywhere and volunteering. I did a lot of volunteering. And so that's how you get to know people. And then know that there isn't any one way to get where you want to go. So, I wasn't the best student. I'm ADHD and severely dyslexic. And, I grew up, I was a kid in the 80s. So dyslexia, ADHD wasn't really a thing you diagnosed. You just had to go home and memorize spelling words and then fail a spelling test every week and get detention. Not that I would know, not bitter, but, I learned how to not study in high school and just sort of, did fine. And then in college, I just kind of squeaked by and got to grad school, and you can no longer do that. So I got my butt handed to me a few times, almost failed out, figured everything out. So I like to tell my students, I want you to get your butt kicked early as opposed to later, please. I will try to do that to some extent, but don't wait until you're in grad school like I did. But even if something doesn't work out, if you don't quite figure it out soon enough, or you fail or whatever, there are alternative ways of doing it. There isn't ever just one path, and grades are one way. If you do really well in school, have high GPA, do everything perfectly, that is one way to get where you want to go. There are a million one other ways. They might take way longer. They might look very different. You might have to forge that path yourself, but it's for what you need in your time. And if you want to do something, you'll get it done. It just may not look exactly like everybody else. So do what is right for you at any given point. And this is usually what I tell students who failed their first class in college, because it's hard. I know. And especially if you're coming from a small place and you're used to everybody, suddenly you're in this huge area and on your own for the first time, and it's really hard. And so there's a bunch of different ways to do that and really lean into your strengths. I also suggest everybody take a theater class if you're going to go into forensics, because man, that has served me better than anything else. Yeah.
So, well, first of all, too, I had a thought just that trying to tell a college student to figure out what they want.
I know.
Personally, for me, is a lot, because I did not figure out what I wanted to do. Yep. I've done a lot of different things, including teach biology and anatomy and physiology for high school students. So I just wanted to ask, so on animals, on humans, we have bugs on us when we're alive.
Yes.
When we die, do those bugs die as well? Or are they then competing with the flies that are colonizing?
Well, it depends on the bug, of course.
Okay.
But for our ectoparasites, like our lice, the mites that are on us, if the animals have fleas, whatever it is, they need a living host. And that means as soon as the body temperature begins to dip, they're going to get out as fast as possible. If it is something like a bot fly, which actually the maggot embeds in the skin, they can die if they are not big enough to survive after they leave, because it's so hard to find a host. Fleas can get pretty quickly off, and they will literally jump ship as soon as that body temperature dips a little bit, and they're really good at surviving in the wild. Lice, this is fascinating. So the lice, especially head lice on humans, they will lay eggs, on their hair shafts, and they can regulate the temperature that the eggs experience by laying them closer or further away on the head shaft. And so we found that they lay pretty well a consistent distance from the scalp when the human is alive. But if that human is dead, they'll start laying closer and closer to try to pick up that body heat that is left as the body cools down through algor mortis. And so I don't know if we've mathematically figured out the formula to figure out how long a person's been dead from that, but there's the possibility. So it's definitely a significant change. So either they like jump ship and they try to leave, or they try to use stuff. And if it's maggots, there are some that can live on both living and dead humans, some that can't. So it really just depends on the thing.
Sure. I kind of have my own slightly off topic too, which is, with kind of the climate shifting, are you noticing migration patterns of insects moving? And is that just your research? Okay.
Yeah, that is actually one of the reasons that entomologists tend to be on the forefront of climate change research, is because insects have a preferred temperature, and they can go a little bit around it, but if it gets too hot, too cold, whatever, they cannot survive in that area, or they have to hybrid or something. And so that means that these insects that traditionally like it really, really warm used to just live right around the equator in these really warm areas, tropical areas. Now they're starting to move more and more north and south into more temperate areas. Now, most of our disease-carrying insects are in those tropical areas, and now they're starting to move. And so we're starting to get mosquitoes carrying disease go further and further north. We're starting to get ticks, the same thing, like Lyme disease. We're watching this really closely because Lyme disease is spread by the host animals as they carry the ticks. So it's officially spread by ticks, but they're tiny and they can't really run that far. But if they get on a deer, say, they can go super far. And so we're watching as their main deer host, the white-tailed deer, its range is expanding exponentially now. And then they're moving into areas, and some of those areas, the ticks died because they just couldn't handle it. Now they're much more temperate, they're nicer. And so the ticks are surviving and spreading more Lyme disease. And that same thing is happening with all these different diseases. And there are some insects that, we get a lot of invasive insects as we move back and forth. Some they would invade and just die because the temperature wasn't right. As the climate changes, they're finding more and more places to survive. And that's why we're seeing more and more like dramatic issues. Like during the pandemic, there was a whole thing with the murder hornet came out. And I mean, that has moved around quite a bit. It's just, it found a place where it was able to survive for a little bit. And it wasn't able to survive forever. Hobo's back. And, but they are surviving much longer than we would like because they can cause a real problem. And so we're watching that happen, and it's going to get worse and worse in places where there were certain pests that were never a problem. They're going to become a problem, and people are going to get sick and animals are going to die, and it's all that. And so, that is the major issue from our end, is we're all going to die is pretty much how we always think in our head. Yeah. We're fun at parties.
The same here. I mean, don't they call malaria like humanity's deadliest killer?
Because there are so many people in the malaria belt, that area where the people are susceptible, and there's a reservoir host in animals, and the mosquito lives, and we have the disease. I mean, it used to be endemic here, and we got rid of it. And every once in a while, we do have local transmission of that disease because we have the vector in the animals and the humans and everything. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's primarily in places where all those things work together, which tend to be clustered around the equator and other warm areas. As we're getting further and further north or further and further south, they're going to move because they have wings. They're good at it. And yeah, we're starting to see that area expand. And that's why everybody was freaking out years ago about this. All the entomologists were like, bad no. But then it's also why that RNA vaccine that was developed for COVID, we're all excited about, because there's so many viruses that mosquitoes carry or other insects carry that we haven't been able to get a vaccine for because of a variety of reasons that might be fixed with this RNA stuff. And so things like dengue fever, we haven't been able to do a vaccine over that, and the RNA looks super promising. And so we're super excited about that because that's even deadlier than malaria. And as climate change comes in and they expand, we're all going to get it. And it's called breakbone fever for a reason, and we don't want that. We're against it in general. So yeah, there's all manner of things that go into it. It's crazy and terrifying and exciting at the same time.
Right.
This is why we all drink. We drink a lot.
We a couple of podcast episodes ago, we talked to some people in horticulture, and they were talking about their own, concerns with migration and climate change happening. So it's a thing for sure.
Yeah, the agricultural community is like, oh God.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, a thing kind of minimalizes it.
Yeah.
Maybe to, I guess, not change the tone, but
keep talking.
We're just random questions now.
Yeah. That'll be the best podcast. It's 4 hours.
So excited for this
questions back and forth.
Well, you do have a chapter called True Crime Buff Chronicles.
Yes,
and
I do.
You do, as someone who has extensively researched real life crimes, what particular true crime kind of fascinates you?
Oh man. I personally like the stuff that has some unusual aspect to it. I mean, if there's an entomologist involved, of course, I'm always going to be on board with that. But if something is unusual, I like that a lot. Like I was glued to my TV set for that the Darrell Brooks trial this past fall, because he represented himself, and I teach an expert witness testimony to pre-law students. And like, that is it's like a case of don't do this. Oh my God. But it was amazing. And there was so much interplay there between the judge and the prosecutors and the defendant and all that. It was really fascinating to see how that worked. And then, of course, as forensic scientists, we're all bloodthirsty. I think like anybody who's into it, we're all bloodthirsty. My students, super bloodthirsty. So one of the questions I always ask them is like, who's your favorite serial killer? And you can usually tell if somebody is going to do well in forensics or be into this, if they're like, oh, it's XYZ, but then my second one is this, and this is why. And then someone else is like, what? Oh, you're not one of us. Okay, no, you're fine. You'll do great. Yeah, you're going to change your major. I figured. Yeah, I know. But yeah, so it's those of us who are into this. Yeah, it's usually, for me, it has to be something unusual, either a high body count or a really weird method, or just something that affects something I care about, or, whatever. And then every once in a while I get into stuff that would make a really neat lesson for my classes or something interesting to write about in the book. I'm like, ooh, I'm going to add this. So I have a whole series of notes on my notes app between like add to lectures or add to textbook on things that I just see. And then I just deep dive into those. And that, yeah. And my first day of class, I always ask, what's your favorite serial killer? And then is there something on here? Look through the syllabus. Is there something that I'm not covering that you want to know about? And I've been doing this for long enough that usually I've covered most of the stuff, but every once in a while, a student will text me or come up to me and have a question or have a request about something. Or like last semester, I had a student come up like, my aunt was a victim of a serial killer. What now? You're coming to my office. Hi, tell me everything. And they love telling those stories when they're forensic scientists. Otherwise, I just don't hear about it. So it really just depends on that. And then if it's something that would be really interesting to write about or to talk about, I really pay attention. And so, yeah, that's how I get a lot of the content, is just news stories. Like, ooh, ADHD is pinging. I'm going to go on a quick hyper focus for the next 2 months.
Wow. My design team, maybe their true calling was a forensic entomology, because they are listening to Morbid 24/7.
I'm gonna be honest, I do too.
Yeah.
Well, it's a certain
Red-handed. I like red hand. We're talking about other podcasts.
It's a certain type of special person that loves this sort of stuff the way that we do. And yeah, I really think it's that intellectual curiosity and that that need to understand what happened, why. It's that asking the question why over and over again. So most people who do this are pretty much born scientists. Like, why did this happen? But why? But why? And a lot of the true crime buffs are that they ask that all the time, and you make the best scientists. So yeah, you two should just be scientists. What are you doing? Come take my class.
Incorporate so many different types of science as well, right? You know, psychology, social psychology, but also forensic science, all different types of forensic
literally
science.
Everything, and it's just applied.
Exactly.
I mean, heck, we've brought in artists and things into the forensic sciences for various reasons. And I mean, one of the most called for ones right now is that facial reconstruction. So you have to be an artist in order to do it, because you need skills, but it's that molding of the face from the underlying bones in order to give a face to, say, a skeletonized body. And artists coming to that are like, oh, I didn't know I could do this. Yeah. Oh my God. Yes. Or for life drawing or that sort of thing. Or art theft is so freaking huge. So art historians are in desperate need, and like all manner of stuff like that. It's pretty much anything you're into, there's a forensic science for it. That's beautiful.
Now that I'm thinking about it as well, I'm actually reading a true crime book.
What are you reading?
It's a Louise Penny book, so it's fictional. It's not a.
Oh, what is it? Which one is it? I've read all of hers.
Oh, it's only the second one. I just discovered her. So.
Oh my God, it's so good, and she has so many.
I read the first one, Still Life, in 2 days.
Yes.
Now I'm on the second one.
Yes. Yeah, I read crime like there's no tomorrow. Like that is what is in my ears.
The cozy mysteries are my
yes, the silly little mystery,
but also you get the police aspect. So I like
sometimes a recipe at the end, or how to knit something, and that is the best. I make them all.
Poetry and
right. So good.
Highly recommend. Anyway. Well, and we were talking about a little bit about your book. You mentioned what's something that like a student has suggested that you've added?
Oh my goodness. Pretty much anytime I have a serial killer mentioned in there, I have that. The forensic psychology section, since I'm not a psychologist, it was really small, but I have a lot of students really wanting to go into that. So I had to do a deep dive into that. And actually one of the chapters is a guest author from a forensic psychologist, because I wanted to make sure that the information was real. So I have a couple of chapters, one on, like serial murder and that sort of thing, sort of the facts. And then I have a chapter from the forensic psychologist from that perspective, so that students know exactly what to expect and what to do. And then I have him come in and usually give a guest lecture as well when possible. I've had students ask for fire. Again, I'm not, I wasn't a fire expert. I did a lot of work on that lately, but somebody wanted to go and be a fire marshal and do that sort of thing. So I went, all right. So I wrote an entire chapter for them. I've written sections on things that they're going to learn later on. So there's a whole section in there on DNA and expression of genes and that sort of thing. And I wrote that because the student came back and said, well, I'm in this class and I don't understand this particular concept, and I really wish you'd be able to explain it to me. And I'm like, well, I can if you want. So I did. And then I went, well, okay, they still have access to this book. So I just wrote it in there so they could go and do that. And then anytime I hear a student, because they'll come to my little office suite and just sort of hang out in the lounge. And if I hear them complaining about something they don't understand, I put that in the textbook. If it's something that I know they're going to learn in another class, that maybe that professor doesn't want to spend 2 weeks trying to get them to remember what they learned years ago, I'll put it in the textbook. And so I ask a lot of the other professors as well, what do you want them to know coming in? And over time, I've had professors come in and say, students didn't know this concept. They didn't understand what a model organism was. Like, okay. And then I just find a place to put it and it's in there. And then the other professors can all say, I know you know it because it's in the book because I watched her write it. So it's on this page. Go look it up. And so, yeah, it's really pretty much anything I can put in there. And I do.
Do you cover all of those concepts then in class too? Or is it more like a resource they can go look at?
It's a little bit of both. So the way that I've designed the text is I want it to be really broad background for everything I'm talking about. And then the idea is the students will read the assigned chapter. They'll get their first exposure to this entirely large concept, like say it's forensic DNA. And so I have a DNA chapter. I want them to read it. Since I don't know what their background is necessarily in this class, I try to assume they don't know anything and I want to get everybody up to the same level. So some students may read this, it's a full review, whatever. Other students, this might be the first time they've truly read it. So I read it that way and I put in as many of those deep dive basic concepts as I can. So we go over bonding, hydrogen bonding for DNA. We go over RNA, DNA, et cetera, protein expression, like everything. And then in class, I talk about the most important stuff for the class. And then that way they have this really broad background. And then I focus in on what is necessary in class. And we have a very limited amount of time. But then if there are major concepts or things that I really want them to understand, that is in the textbook. And I can say, well, if we don't have time in lecture, I can say, go and read this one section in the textbook very closely because you're going to need this to understand the next 3 things. And then I build in like they have to practice it. And so it's designed for that prepping their brain to hear it in class. And then if they read it a second time, they really know what's important. And then I make sure I go into depth on a lot of the foundational principles, I call them in my class. So things like with DNA, a foundational principle is bonding. And so hydrogen bonds versus everything else, because that dictates the melting point of DNA and how much energy is needed to break apart those base pairs in order for transcription and all that. So I want them to know that because then we can calculate how much heat it's going to take to melt apart DNA. And that's something they do every day in a crime lab. And so any of those foundational principles that they really need to know to apply this, I make sure is in there. And then they can come back to this later on in their careers or whatever and look up these foundational principles, or in another class, if it's something they go, you should have learned this last semester. They go, oh, wait, no, it's in the text. Okay, I can go and read it real fast. So I just try to touch on all of those, focus on the forensic science aspect, but then allow them to use this as a reference.
Right. And the ability to be able to make those quick changes.
Oh, that has changed everything. So you asked me before why I decided to do a digital text like this. And that was really the number one reason. When I first started teaching, the standard is you have your textbook, you choose from some catalog somewhere. And most of the time we just start out with whatever textbook has been used when we took over the class, or whatever one we find on Amazon, or whatever our bookstore on campus has, and then you go through it and you find the readings that are appropriate. And as I was going through my classes, because I teach both veterinary entomology and forensic science, and I've written a digital text for both of them. And as I was going through that, I found that there was no print textbook that was perfect. I would always have to be like, okay, go buy this textbook and then buy this other book, or I'll find a bunch of papers to post for you, or go to the library. And it was just this mishmash of things that I made them do. And then every year it seemed like, especially in forensics, that textbook would be rewritten to a new version. And then they would have to buy it new again. And at the university, if you buy a written textbook, you can sell it back for a fraction of the price or whatever, but at least you get a little bit of money back. But you can't do that if there's a new version out. And these every year it was getting more and more and more expensive. And so students were spending just thousands of dollars on textbooks for all their classes. And they might be the person who doesn't really read it, or, or they're on a limited income. So they have to choose which one to get, and to ask them to buy a $300 textbook every semester and not know if they're going to be able to sell it back. And if they're not going into forensics, maybe they don't want to keep it. Maybe they're just taking this for funsies. Or if the world changes, then suddenly it's obsolete and it's just sitting there. And all of that was an issue. So between the money, how quickly these subjects change, and that ability, I can update this text in real time. So like a few years ago, I have in one of my chapters some information about Charles Manson. He's one of the most popular serial killers when I asked students, so I wrote something about him. But he was in prison, and one year he got engaged, and that was fascinating to watch. So I immediately added that. And then the next year he died in the middle of the semester. And so, like I had in that textbook, he is still in prison. He's up for parole this time. So I was able to go in that day and change it. He died on this date at this time in prison, and so it was immediate, real information that had just happened. None of that, like, no, this is an old book type of look. It's nope, this is new and it just happened and now it's there. And that change can happen within minutes. It's so fast. And so I love that. And then the book is up to date, and students can keep it and read it forever. And then they'll get pushed any new updates that I give them. So even if they took it, last year, 2 years ago, whatever is new in there now will be in their textbook. And so I know that these future forensic scientists have the most up-to-date information, which makes me feel a little bit better about the world in general, really.
Well, and not just the most up-to-date information about serial killers, but also
everything.
Most up-to-date, right, for all of the other different forensic science chapters that you have. So
and there's so much constantly coming out. There's new cases that set precedent. There's new Supreme Court rulings. There's all this stuff. And whenever there's a new technology or some new way that technology was used and it's been published in one of the journals or something, I can write that up immediately. If there's a new challenge against old stuff, like fingerprints lately have been subject to legal challenges because we really don't know the statistics behind them. We don't know how likely it is that someone else is going to have the exact same fingerprint as you. We've just never done it. It's just one of those traditional things that it was said back in the day, therefore it is, but now it's being challenged a lot. And there's a lot of crazy stuff going on around it. So I want those challenges to be documented so that students know where they stand and how to make this, their evidence stronger when needed. And so, that sort of thing. It's really easy to change that. And I love that.
And that goes into the implications of your work. People have gotten the death penalty for outdated arson information.
Absolutely.
The ability to change this on the fly is not only helpful for the students, but potentially the people they're helping to defend.
Yeah, exactly. And if they have the best information, then they can do their best work. And there's just a lot of problems out there with, incorrect convictions or outdated information or incorrect analysis of that information. And then when that finally comes to light, now, the state or the federal government or whoever are on the hook for that because they incorrectly incarcerated somebody and they need to pay for that. And so it's a lot of that going back and forth. And so, it's one of those things where it's, I do not want to train students badly. I think it's just a general rule of thumb.
Would you have any advice for someone who's starting to write their own material or their own textbook?
So the way that I wrote both of these books was I had to lock myself away for several weeks to get it all done. And so I basically just went and rented a cabin for a month and just sat there, and I worked within my own circadian rhythm. I'm a night person, and so I was like getting up in the afternoon and drinking a lot of coffee and staying up until 5 or 6 a.m. and then going to bed. But that's when I would get my best writing done. I just had it set up where there was nobody around, I brought my husband and my dogs. And then I just focused on writing. There was nothing else to do. So that got the bulk of it done for me. But what I did before that was I did a lot of prep. So I looked at how I was designing my classes and how I was designing the material, and then thought about, okay, why am I teaching them what I'm teaching? Again, I just asked that why question 1,000,001 times. And then I went out and asked the other professors, what do you want them to know? I asked previous students, what do you wish you had known? So like for my vet ento book, I reached out to a bunch of my vet students who had been in my class and then have gone on to vet school, reached out to a bunch of students who are now veterinarians. And I asked them, what do you wish you had known going into vet school about bugs or anything? And they gave me this laundry list. I went, okay, well, I'm covering at least that. I did the same thing in the forensics book. And then I went through and thought about, where do our students go? And so I checked the job boards and said, okay, they need to have XYZ knowledge. Okay, let's make sure that's included. And then I have very strong opinions about things. So I added all that. And so I just sort of created this outline of, here's what needs to be in here. And what's nice about the digital text is I can use color photos for, no extra cost. It's not like I have to find a good black and white photo because it's going to be printed. I can use links to places. So there are places I link out to, like YouTube videos of stuff if needed. I can put in custom graphics. So I did a lot of like graphic design on my iPad, and I'm not great at it, but it worked with shapes. So I could get the exact graphic I wanted, or I could use pre-made graphics from other places, and I was able to add all of that. And then there was no real page limit. So I could just write to my heart's content. And I've written other chapters and other things like in print media before. And a lot of times they're like, this needs to be this many pages or less because it's going to be printed. And you're trying to cut down what you want to say. And as you know, I'm very verbose, obviously. And so my writing reflects that. I just don't edit that because I want the students to hear this in my voice, basically. And so I write the way that I talk. And that does not lead to very short material. And so this made, I could just write forever. And then as I was writing, I would come up with ideas. It's like, oh, I'm writing this concept, but for somebody to come in and really understand it, they need to know this other stuff. Like there's a whole chapter I have in there about statistics. And that wasn't originally on the plan. I was writing the DNA chapter and I was talking about, it's a 1 in 15 trillion chance or whatever it is now that someone else randomly has your DNA. And I'm like, well, how do we know that? Well, did the students know this? Oh, no. I'm going to write another chapter. So then I just took a quick hiatus and wrote another chapter real fast, slotted it in, and then went back. And then as you're writing, you can refer back to those chapters. You're like, I know what I wrote. I just wrote it. So, yeah. And so that made it really, really flexible and really, really nice. So it's that sort of thing. Plan it out as much as you can. You can take whatever time you need to do your due diligence and figure out what needs to be out there. But remember, you're the expert and you're writing this for your purposes. So I wrote it specifically for my class. This is what I want them to know. Therefore, this is what they're going to know. And that made it really easy. And then I wrote it in my own voice. I didn't try to make it like when I write publications for scientific publications, you make it sound sciencey, you use the big words and all that. And I learned with these textbooks, I was like, I'm gonna make the jokes and I'm gonna write as I talk, and I'm gonna go off and tell stories on the side. And I have a whole series of footnotes in there because I do things in class where I give like little side stories, and it's just whatever pops into my head. I'm like, oh, I want to tell you this, it's funny. And so those I made into footnotes, and that works really well because it doesn't interrupt the flow, but students can go and get my jokes in there. And there's one chapter I'm in like a footnote fight with the guest author, and that was funny for us. And then the poor editors were like, do you want this in here? I'm like, yeah, no, it's fine. And they're like, okay, because it looked like a real fight. That's amazing, it worked. So yeah, write in your own voice, plan it out, and it's yours for your students. And so you have this maximum flexibility, use it.
Do you feel like you've noticed a difference in your students? Did they like the text?
Oh man, they read it so much. Yeah, especially the forensic science students, and they keep it forever, it feels like. And so I will get students coming in and making jokes about the jokes I made in the textbook. And students will read this willingly, which makes me happy. Because I don't like reading boring stuff personally. So I tried not to be boring when writing. But yeah, and they're much more willing to buy it because it's reasonably priced. They can get it instantly. There's no back order. It updates constantly, so they feel like it's less of I'm just buying this thing for 15 weeks and then it's going to be the most expensive, I don't know, book stand ever or something. But because it's constantly updated and they can use it in perpetuity, they feel like it's an investment more than anything else. And a lot of them have my same sense of humor, so they like seeing something written where they would make the same jokes and sort of get side-eyed by their family and friends. And so they like reading it in public around normies, as we call them, the non-forensically bent people. Like, what are you reading? Oh, it's just about dead bodies. What are you reading? Coffee shop with their computer, their tablet, and it's just body pictures. And they love that. Yeah. And that's another thing with GRL is they're so good at giving us or giving me pretty much whatever I asked for. I could do some crazy thing like, hey, I'm teaching this random class online. Can I have a section? They're like, yeah, done. Well, oh, we're not even off the phone. Okay. That was amazing. Okay. And yeah. And I'm able to get access codes for, I've got students who are going through some tough times, or, I've got students, a couple of homeless students and things like that. So if students cannot afford something, I'm allowed just to give them an access code. And I've had students who, are taking care of their family and, their parents are in the hospital or they're going through cancer treatments or, it's something. And they just do not have the money to buy something else this semester, but they want to finish their degree. And so I'm able to just hand over access and nobody gives me any problems for that. It's just, I call up and say, hey, I need a couple of things, like, okay. And it's done. And they get instant access to this thing and they don't have to worry about lugging it around anywhere. It's optimized for any device. And so they can do what they need to do wherever they're at, no matter their circumstances. And that makes me really, really happy.
They're really good, even as employees, recognizing that we're all going through our own journeys, and they're going to accommodate you.
Yeah. And they're kind in general and really, really supportive, which is amazing. The first time I wrote a textbook for you, I think it was it the Vet Ento one? Yeah, I think it was the Vet Ento one that I wrote first. And I found out about it simply because I'd been writing it just in PDF form because I was so tired of the Vet Ento textbooks. And I was just trying to get it to the students and there was no editing involved. And so it was just my stream of consciousness and my dyslexia involved. And that was bad. But actually GRL was on campus and they came to talk to me and just say, hey, this is what we do. And I was like, ooh, can you do anything with this ridiculous pile of things I have? And they're like, yes.
Yeah.
We have editors to fix the spelling. Fantastic. And so that's how I got to know them. And then that was a fast turnaround process. But I was able to tell, the editor I was working with, I said, here's the thing, it's the middle of the semester. I'm scattered everywhere. I am not going to sit down and do anything unless I have a deadline. That's the ADHD again. I work on deadlines. And because they were being very kind, like, get it done when you do. And I'm like, oh, so never is what never done. That's how my brain just heard that. I'm sorry. And so I tell the editor, I'm like, hey, I need deadlines. And oh man, she was a deadline fiend. And it would be like, we are meeting on Monday. This is what I expect done. And then the one time I missed it, I was in trouble. Like, it was terrifying on that. I am very disappointed in you. Oh my God, I will never disappoint you again.
The editor was.
I'm going to go back and find out. Yeah.
It was the worst, best thing on earth. And so then I was like, okay, because then I got stuff done and it was great. And the students loved it. And it worked so seamlessly with my class and I loved it. And so then when I want to do this forensic science one, I called them up and I said, hey, I want to do this. And they were a little nervous, like, well, how much do you have written? Because they don't want me coming in and be like, nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Can you publish it tomorrow? They're so good at asking the right questions. Like, you know that they're used to dealing with people like me. And so I was like, well, I have, 30 chapters. And they're like, oh, okay, great. What deadlines do you want? And what are we going to do? And then when I went and just locked myself away to finish everything, I said, this is what I'm doing. And they're like, okay, you call us, we won't bother you for this amount of time, but the deadline that you set for yourself, we are on you. And they were. It was amazing. And so yeah, the support was just absolutely incredible. And the ridiculous covers, because they'd be like, well, what do you want? And they would usually put together something pretty basic. Like, what do you think? I'm like, well, that's what I'm thinking. They're like, okay. And they come back with these great photoshopped, beautiful ideas, like so good. And yeah, like the forensic one is a little Sherlock Holmes bloodhound, and so perfect, because I had no idea. And I was like, I don't know, make it funny and adorable, and I like animals, go. And that's what they came up with, and it was freaking perfect. And then for the vet ento one, it's a dog with a caterpillar on his head, and that makes me laugh every time. I framed the photo and put it on my wall at my office because I like it so much. It's just so good. And yeah, so just the amount of support on the stuff that I don't know how to do is absolutely incredible. And then when I have an idea, as ridiculous as it may be, I'll call up and we'll make it work. And so that has been the best thing on earth, because I know some of these ideas are just out of left field. And they're like, you want to do, okay, we'll call you back. Let me go talk to somebody and see if that's possible. And then it is magically in ways I never thought. So that's pretty cool.
I was gonna say, it's usually possible.
I know, it's been great.
This may be the first one to ask us if we can. So
yeah, and it's
but that's
fine. I integrated my lab book into my vet ento one, and there's a bunch of dichotomous keys on identifying stuff with a bunch of links, a bunch of different places. And I wanted it interactive, and I don't know if this is possible, but can you? And within a week it was done, and it was beautiful. And yeah, it was absolutely perfect. And then because I'm me, there's typos and things in there that I miss. And if the editors miss it because it's content as opposed to, just spelling, that's a problem. But we have this thing set up where I give my students extra credit for finding mistakes in the textbook, and they fill out a form, and then I just send that form to the editors to fix. And so that has been wonderful. They're like, here's how we want you to send it. Great. I'll have my students fill it out.
That's a great idea.
Because sometimes I don't know. Oh God.
Okay. At the end of all of our episodes, we like to do a segment called You're Wrong. It's not that you're wrong, but it's everyone else that's wrong. All right. This is your opportunity to kind of rant and explain any misconception or,
Bugs are not gross. Bugs are the best. And I get a lot of people who are scared of insects for some reason or another, or they only like butterflies. Butterflies are boring. I mean, they're pretty, it's fine. But the pretty bugs are usually the ones that are not even close to being interesting. Insects rule the world. One, they are freaking everywhere. They've been here long before all of us. They will be here long after we're all gone. And they do absolutely everything in the world. They're so good. 99.99% of the time, they're not trying to hurt you in any way, including the bees or the wasps or whatever. You just let them be, and they're fine. If you figure out a way to make it more annoying to be near you than away from you, then you don't even get ants in your house. And so that's how we do pest control in this household. But they're the absolute best. And maggots are the cutest. Don't come at me. They are so adorable. They can't bite you. They don't have claws. They're just little bags of guts that want cuddles. Come on.
Thank you, Adrienne, for joining us on today's episode and for sharing your experience as a forensic entomologist and your knowledge of bugs. In any area of study, but especially in the sciences and forensic sciences, it is crucial to be able to teach students using the most up-to-date information. As research and our understanding of forensic entomology evolves, it's important that you're able to make rapid changes to your textbook to include those new methods, data, and case studies. It also shows a commitment to your students, ensuring that you include relevant and interesting topics in your textbook that will help them as scientists and professionals in their future careers.
Entomology is a window into a world most people ignore or fear or are repulsed by. But after this conversation, it's a world that feels so much closer and more relevant. Forensic entomology might not be CSI, but it comes with a duty to use methodology and research to bring justice to victims and to those in need of defense.
Can I Get a Retake is hosted by Michelle Manneman and Macayla Albee. The show is edited by Maggie Christensen. Artwork for the podcast was designed by Michelle Manneman. Our intro and outro music was created by Coma Media.
If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please subscribe, share, rate, and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts. To join the conversation, you can find us on Instagram at Can I Get a Retake. For show notes and episode transcripts, visit greatriverlearning.com/podcast.